If you have a Bible, please turn to Genesis chapter 37. If you don't have one, just feel free to sit there and feel guilty. It's a long-running tradition in the Western Church since the Reformation of guilt and shame, and it's a great motivator in the short term, and I'm only here for a night, so that's fine for me. So, Genesis chapter 37. Let's pray. Father, other than Jason and a few others, I don't know very many people in the room. But what a crazy thing to think about the fact that we will be together with you forever and ever and ever. The language of the scriptures for eternity. And so God, may tonight function as a preview, a glimpse, just a small taste of what is to come. May you drag the future into the present. May you drag your kingdom, your rule, your reign, this coming day when all will be right and there will be no more injustice and no more scandal in Hollywood and no more threat of nuclear war and no more sexism or racism or economic disparity. All will be well. Would you drag that future reality that we are literally banking our entire life on its truth? Would you drag that into the here and the now? Would it break into a cultural moment that is the exact opposite? And into our own heart or mind or body or relationship or broken relationship or dream or shattered dream where that's not the reality? And would your kingdom come right here, right now, in Langley, as it is in heaven. Amen. Genesis 37. Let's just read for a minute. There's a story here at the beginning. Take a look at verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about him. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of corn out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "You are an idiot. Why would you say that out loud? Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. But then he had another dream. And he told it to his brothers too. He's not that sharp yet, right? "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When his father, as well as his brothers, heard this, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph was a dreamer. God's people have always been dreamers, at least to some extent. As long as God has been in relationship with his people, he has been giving them dreams. Now, when I say dreams, I don't just mean literal dreams while you are asleep. That, and I believe in that more now than ever before. But I mean dreams in a much broader sense, as in any kind of vision for your future, and more specifically for the role that you are to play in the family of God. A prophetic word over your life from church, or a moment, or an experience, or a sense from listening prayer, or this gut sense deep in the marrow of your bones that you just can't shake. I think this is going to happen, or that is going to happen, or I think I was made to do this, or I think I was made to do that. Maybe your dream is for a career. Maybe it is for a relationship, marriage, or a family, or children. Maybe it's for justice. Maybe it's for a problem or an issue in our society. Maybe it's to plant a church or start a business or invent good vegan ice cream. I have no idea what it is. But the odds are that somewhere deep down in your heart, in the language of the Old Testament, that fulcrum of your desire, deep in there, is a dream. if not 2 or 3 or 4 or more. And the odds are also that at least part of that dream, or part of those dreams, were put there by the Spirit of God himself. You see, dreams play a key role in our life. Without dreams, we get sucked into the tyranny of the urgent, to the endless stream of the Netflix queue, or whatever is the thing up here. Is it Netflix? Is it Amazon? Is it, I don't know. I can't imagine a world where Netflix isn't at the top, but whatever, it's Canada, you never know. You get sucked into that, into digital distraction, into just busyness and event to event, and you just waste your life on trivia and wander your way through year after decade after lifetime. Dreams are like a map for the road of life, or at least, if not a road, at least a compass heading. In the language of the self-help literature, dreams are how we, quote, start with the end in mind. Meaning, dreams are one of the primary ways that God is leading us and guiding us into our identity and our calling. What I mean by that is who we were made to be and what we were made to do. But the problem is that dreams are a little bit tricky to live with, because there is always a gap between the dream and the reality. And in that gap, which might be a few weeks long or a few decades long, in that gap, we all run the gamut from hope and anticipation, and I can't wait, and I'm on the edge of my seat, and faith and patience and hard work and discipline, to the other side of doubt and despair and disillusionment, and I want to give up, and what is on Netflix again? And the whole thing was a sham. Enter Joseph. I would argue that Joseph's biography is a paradigm for how we are to live in the gap between the dream and the reality, or what I mean by that is the fulfillment of that dream. Because for Joseph, and the odds are for you, and I know for me, the journey from dream to reality is rarely, if ever, a straight line. It's far more like zigzag and 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and for most of it is quite honestly a very long and very hard road. Now, it would take all evening to read Joseph's story. It's about 10 chapters long. So let me just read a few key moments to you in the story. Is that okay? So let's just read Bible for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll circle back and talk about what it means for us today, okay? Keep reading the story. Pick it up in verse 12, next part. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." Very well, he replied. So he goes off on his errand for dad to check in on his brothers. Skip down to 19, or verse 18. When they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said. Notice the language. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue. "Hey, don't kill him. Throw him into the cistern and we'll rescue him," or something. But then the story goes on, they see this band of slave traders instead. Skip down to verse 28. "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him down to Egypt." Now, notice, you have a story about dreams, and then you have this one. This is the exact opposite of the dream. In the dream, Joseph's brothers are bowing down to him. In reality, so far, he's bowing down to his brothers. In the dream, he is a ruler, and in the story so far, he is a slave. Then he goes down to Egypt, and he is literally a slave in the house of a man named Potiphar. He has a run-in with Potiphar's wife, and there's a false charge, an accusation of sexual abuse, and all of that. And we know what that feels like a lot right now. And then you read the story in chapter 40. Turn the page. Sometime later, Joseph is put into prison, right, on a false charge. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer, the chief baker. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Now, what coincidence. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, they each had a dream on the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected, so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered. "There's no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Do not all interpretations belong to who? To God. Tell me your dreams." Story goes on, they tell the dreams, Joseph interprets the dreams, and then skip down to the very end, verse 20. Now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all of his officials, lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in his presence, restored one, the other he impaled, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. Exactly how he thought. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now, notice that in the story, Joseph, here he is, still waiting on this dream from now years before, and now he is able to interpret somebody else's dream, and he's spot on, but his own dream is still unfulfilled. Years later, and he is rotting away in a dungeon. Literally, that last line in the story is, he forgot him. The story goes on. Next chapter, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. So now just everybody's dreaming. It's like the rage, all the rage in ancient Mesopotamia. He's standing by the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat. They grazed among the reeds. This is his whole dream. I'm not going to read it to you. This story is really long. Skip down to verse 8. In the morning, Pharaoh's mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them. So the chief cupbearer says, oh, I remember this guy from years before. I was in prison. He was amazing. What was his name again? I can't remember. Something. And they call for Joseph. And look at 14. Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. So notice, now there's a dramatic shift in the story. All in a moment, out of the blue. All out of the moment. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream. No one can interpret it. But I've heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So that's his reputation. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So, same thing happens. Pharaoh tells his dream, Joseph interprets his dream, and skip down to the very end. Look at verse 38. Pharaoh asked them, can we find anybody like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? So the most powerful man on earth at the time. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and, notice the language, wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace. All my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Okay, so this is a huge moment. This is like a before and after watershed kind of moment. Now the slave is turned into a ruler. He is the second in command for the most powerful man and the most powerful empire on earth at the time. But still, the dream is not really fulfilled. He has not seen his brothers, much less his mom or his dad, and his family in years by this point. That happens later. Turn the page, chapter 42, and just stay with me. I know I'm so sorry just to read the Bible to you. I apologize, but just stay with me. Chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob learned, this is a bit later, that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you keep looking at each other? That's such a dad line, by the way. Why do you keep looking at each other? So classic. Maybe that's just an American dad thing. I don't know. Apparently, it's not a Canadian dad thing. I guess that's good. He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. There's a famine all through the ancient Near East and the Sinai Peninsula. So the brothers go down to Egypt. Skip down to verse 6. Now Joseph was the governor, or in Hebrew it's this word ruler, of the land and the person who sold grain to all the people. Again, what a coincidence. When Joseph's brothers arrived, notice the language, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger, spoke harshly, where do you come from, land of Canaan? Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And notice the next line. Then he remembered his dreams. Can you imagine just like another day at the office, running the empire, oppressing the poor, whatever it is you do as the number 2 in command for Egypt, dealing with, global warming in the ancient world or whatever, and drought and all of you, just another day saving the world, and in walk all of your brothers. And it's been years, so long that they don't even recognize you. They literally are there in a conversation with you, and they don't even realize who you are. And then what do? They bow down on the ground before you. Now, there's a whole bunch of drama that happens after this that we don't have time for. This is like the ancient soap opera, Days of Our Lives, Genesis style, all right? Don't have time to read all of that, but it's great, like 10 a.m. reading if you have a day off, something like that. Long story short, the brothers go back home with no clue that it was Joseph they were bowing down to. Then a few years, we think, go by, and the same thing happens again, out of food, there's still a famine, and they come back down to Egypt. And read this, turn the page, chapter 43, just look at verse 26. When Joseph came home, they, the brothers, presented to him the gifts they had brought to the ground. And we read it again. They bowed down before him to the ground. You see what's happening here? The writer of this story is just driving the point home. They, again, second time, they bowed down before him on the ground. Then there's more drama. Again, don't have time, read it on your own. And then the end of the story is here in chapter 45, just a few more paragraphs. Chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Everyone out!" So there's no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. He was weeping so loudly that when the Egyptians heard him, everybody in the house heard about it. Now Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. It's me. I'm your little brother. Is my father still living? Now, his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And you would imagine, like, they are in shock. Wait a minute, little brother is alive and oh, dang it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one that you sold into Egypt, and now don't be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." And the story goes on. What a story, am I right? And that's just the short version. Now, there's a lot that we can learn from Joseph and from this story about dreams and about how to live in the gap between a dream and the fulfillment of that dream. And tonight, I just want you to notice 4 things about Joseph's dream and its fulfillment. When the dream finally does come to pass, it is 1, different, 2, harder, 3, longer, and 4, better. A short word on each. First off, different. Joseph, in the dream, sees his brothers all bowing down to him. He does not see slavery in Egypt. He does not see the prison. He does not see all of the years rotting away in a dungeon and waiting. He sees a little, but he's blind to a lot. Dreams are often like that. The dream is to the reality what a seed is to a tree. All of the raw materials are in that seed, but it's just a small fraction of what is yet to come. When we get a dream from God, we might get 10% of it, or if we're lucky, 50% of it, but there are whole bits and pieces, if not whole chunks, that are not there in our mind's eye. When we see the future, most of the time it's fuzzy. It's not. Master Yoda said something about that. The future is difficult to see, right? Another wise man who was actually a real person by the name of Paul in the New Testament said something very similar. He said, "Now we know in part, but then we shall know as we also are known." The theologian N.T. Wright has this great line about prophecy. He writes, quote, "All prophecy about the future is signposts pointing into the fog." I love that imagery, especially in the Pacific Northwest. We know all about that. Signposts pointing into the fog. It's not a crystal clear photograph, like, oh, it's going to look exactly like this or that or the other. It's a signpost, this direction to Vancouver, this direction to Portland, this direction to whatever. Signposts pointing into the fog. And that's because the point of a dream isn't to tell you what's going to happen in the future, it's to tell you how to live in the present. Let me say that again. The point of a dream isn't to tell you what's going to happen in the future, but to tell you how to live in the present. In fact, God seems, if I'm reading the scripture right, he seems to be against his people knowing the future, at least most of the time. There's an ancient sin that we read about all through the Old Testament called divination, where somebody would divine the future through a witch or a spiritist or a medium of some kind. And divination is still around because there is a human bent in all of us to know the future. whether it is through astrology or a palm reader or through long-range business planning or if you grew up in my church tradition, like weird 1970s, end of the world, Great Tribulation, like map things. It's not a thing up here. I'm still in therapy for it, all right? Like, we want to know the future because knowledge is power. And we think that if we can know the future, then we can have control over the future, and then we don't have to trust God. And if you're anything like me, you don't want to trust God. You want to control your life, not surrender your life. But God doesn't want us to have control. He wants us to have faith. That's why God will rarely, if ever, tell you or me exactly what's going to happen. Because that's just a way to keep us bound up in the need for control in order to have peace. And God's end goal for you is freedom from anxiety, that as you apprentice under Jesus and follow after him, year after year, decade after decade, your anxiety goes down and down and down, and your trust goes up and up and up. And to the degree that you trust God is the degree that you are at peace with your own soul, with your own body, with your own life, with what is, with what isn't, with who you are, with who you aren't, with what your life story is, with what your life story isn't. The more free you are from comparison, the more free you are from competition. Trust me, trust is a good thing. It is worth whatever God has to put you or I through to become the kind of man or woman who, whether you're in a dungeon or the second of command in Egypt, you are rooted in an unshakable trust in God. And because that is God, the loving Father's agenda for your and my life, he will usually just give you and me enough about tomorrow to show us how to live today. In my experience, there is that rare occurrence where God will say, like, here's the 10-year plan, or here's the whatever, like this ABC. Most of the time, I feel like God will just give you an identity. This is who you are, and then he'll give you a next step. So why don't you go do this next? Or do you have a better idea? I think that's kind of how God is, but that's a whole other separate teaching series, all right? But like usually, this is who you are. This is the next step to take. And for most of us, that is enough. We don't need a map. We have something better. We have a guide in God himself. And Jesus, who called himself the good shepherd, the good pastor, that's a leader, that's a guide, that's a you come and follow me. Like, that's beautiful. And so I have learned the hard way to expect that when a dream comes to pass, the odds are it will be at least a little bit, if not a lot different than I was expecting. So first, different. Second, harder. As I said, Joseph sees a picture of his family bowing down to him, but he does not see the slave trade. He does not see the false accusation. He does not see he was forgotten by the chief cupbearer. He does not even see years as this number 2 man, but yet in a faraway land and away from his family. He sees, notice, all of the good and none of the bad. Anybody else like that? You are just not easy right now to talk to. I love you. I want to love you. I really want to love you. Just once. I don't need a lot. Just, isn't this a Pentecostal church? This is like Canadian Pentecostal. This is like, okay, I guess like that explains a lot. We're good. We're okay now. We're okay. All right. But we all do this. I think I'm just going to pretend that we all do this. I know that I do this. When I get a dream, my bent is to romanticize it. The future is like, it's always this warm, fuzzy utopia where everything's amazing and somehow I'm better looking and have a six-pack. I've never had a six-pack, but in my dream I always do. And I'm like fabulously wealthy. I'm like, where did that come from? You're a pastor. How did that happen? I don't know, but I'm fabulously wealthy. And like it's always just, I'm just happy all the time. I just run around on the drug of happiness. And yet, how's that going for most of you in the room? Like, usually reality is a little bit different. I hesitate to say this in a room full of single people for the most part, but marriage is honestly the best example of this. So the church I lead is right in the urban core of Portland, and due to just the cost of living and a number of other factors, the demographic is very young in the city itself. And so our church is, I think, 68% single and under the age of like 35. So there's a lot of Jesus and a lot of love in the air. Let me just put it that way, right? You know how it goes. You know exactly how it goes. And don't like it's you, okay? So on a regular basis, we've been at it for a number of years now, And our church actually started as this Friday night college and young adult thing. So like this just feels like home for me. And I've started to notice this pattern over the last decade where I will see this single woman or single man who's involved in the church, and you get to know them, and they're just fantastic. You're like, this is a great young man or a great young woman. And then they fall in love and they start to date or court or whatever it is people do, just text now, I don't know, whatever. And then the wedding day, and then inevitably they come to me about 6 months in. If they make it a year, they're lucky. And the guy's face is just ashen, and the wife is just like on meds already. And they essentially say to me, I thought I was a good person, and then I got married. And it's like, now I'm such a narcissist, and apparently I'm not in touch with my feelings, and I don't know how to communicate. And I guess the toilet paper, it has to go over and back and down? I didn't even know that was a thing, right? It's actually, I'm the one in the marriage that gets mad about that. That's a whole other teaching series. But, and I will just lovingly sit down, sometimes one-on-one with the guy, and I'll just say, listen, it's not that when you got married, you became a worse person. It's that when you were single, you had no idea what a jerk you are. Because what the reality of marriage will do, and this is actually the beauty of marriage, and the beauty of a close friendship, the beauty of community, the beauty of a small group, is it will expose where you're actually at. And the only way that we ever grow into the best version of ourselves is by fearlessly and faithfully confronting reality. It's the only way. Confronting the reality of who we are and who we're not in the love of the Father, and taking the next step, and the next step, and the next step. That's the only way. My point is that when you're single, most of you in the room, it's really easy in your mind's eye to just think, when I get married, then I'll be happy, everything will be amazing. Listen, marriage is amazing. I've been married for 16 years. We have a lovely wife, 3 lovely children. If you're not happy now, you won't be happy married. One messed up person plus another messed up person does not equal bliss. Like, you do the math on that. It's exponentially more crap. That's what it is. All right? So, this is not rocket science, all right? But if you are who you are, and who you are is far more impacting and influential over your happiness or lack of happiness than anything that does or does not happen to you. It's far more about character than it is about whatever kind of the plot line of your story is. All that to say, it's so easy to buy in this lie, when I get there, then. And when you're single, maybe it's graduation, or it's a career, or it's that promotion, or it's marriage, or then it's a child, or then it's a house in the burbs, or I don't know what it is here. But there's always something. It's this moving target. You get there, and then, it must be the next. You get there, it must be the next. You get there, it must be the next. And part of it, and that's just a myth, we're chasing after the wind. But what we get into our head is this romanticized kind of thing in the future. And with marriage, that honestly I think is why the divorce rate is through the roof. Because we go, and that's more complex than that, but because we go in with all of this idealized, and not real vision of the future with stars in our eyes, and the reality is just much harder. It's not bad, it's just much harder. We think that life is the straight, linear arrow to success, but the reality is it's anything but. It's far more up and down and back and forth. My therapist regularly talks to me about what he calls the gospel of upward mobility. We believe this myth, especially in the Western world, that things will just get better and better and better and better. And that's not all bad. Some of that is what the Spirit is stirring up in you and the gift of Western civilization. But the reality is that life is good, but it's also hard. And the irony is that if you expect life to be easier, it's a lot harder. Whereas if you expect life to be hard, it's quite a bit easier. And Jesus was that might sound like weird, Stoic philosophy. Jesus was all about that. I love that line at the end of John's gospel. In me, you may have peace. In the world, you will have trouble. Peace, trouble. One's a possibility, the other is an inevitability, right? You may have peace, you will have trouble. Psychologists define neurotic behavior, neurotic people, as people who suffer more than they need to, and talk about the fact about how neuroticism is exploding all through the Western world. We suffer more than we need to. Why? Because we don't expect to suffer at all. Because we buy this gospel of upward mobility, everything will be fine, everything will work out, and then life is good, but life is hard, and we're not expecting that, and so it's much harder than it has to be. So I'm just here, if this sounds nihilistic or weird or depressing, or I am from the Pacific Northwest, so maybe it's just that. But I honestly mean this in a loving and encouraging way. When your dream comes to pass, it will be different than you're expecting, and it will be harder, the odds are, than most of us are expecting. Third, longer. Just here to encourage you tonight. Just like a little pep talk, shot in the arm, right? Never invite this guy back. Okay, do the math with me. There are 8 chapters and upwards of 22 years between the dream and the reality. Joseph is 17 when he dreams about his brothers bowing down and all of that. He's 30 when he becomes ruler of Egypt, but 9 more years go by, 7 years of plenty and at least 2 years of famine before the dream comes to pass. 22 years is a very long time. How many of you aren't even 22 years old yet? Yeah, it's okay. Put your hand up. It's like whatever. Just Instagram later, okay? That's a very long time, longer than a lot of you have been alive. As is often said, there is a time gap between the conception of a dream and the birth of a dream. God will often impregnate into your heart, into this fulcrum of your desire, a dream long before it is born out into the world. If you're anything like me, I hear from God, I get an idea, a prophetic word, a literal dream when I'm sleeping, and I think, that sounds amazing. Thursday sound good for you? I can do it sooner if you need to, God, but I'm ready, let's go do it. But often it's months or it's years, or in Joseph's case, it's decades ahead of God's time. As a general rule, the larger the dream, the longer the waiting period. And the smaller the dream, the shorter the wait. Small dream, short wait. Large dream, longer wait. But either way, this waiting period is usually way longer than any of us expect. Did you see that one kind of throwaway line at the beginning of chapter 41? You know anything about Hebrew literature? Keep in mind, this is before a word processor. This is millennia before Gutenberg and the printing press and mass production of paper. Writing is all about economy. So literally, especially in Hebrew literature, every single line, noun, adjective counts. There are very few adjectives in Hebrew literature. You notice that as you read the Old Testament story. You read it's not flowery language. It's all about economy. It's to the point. So every adjective matters. And there's this little line that for us, we read as a throwaway that is like a stop and pay attention. When 2 full years had passed. Just think about that for a moment. Can you imagine how Joseph would have felt? 2 full years. Now, there's no community. He doesn't have what's the cafe meetup thing? What did you call it? Cafe meetup, I got it right. There's no cafe meetup to look forward to Thursday morning at 9, just to kind of, I thought I was getting out of here, but they forgot all about me, and I just feel like there's none of that. This is before the coming of the Holy Spirit. There's no sense of Joseph, alone in his cell with a cup of good coffee and reading the Bible and just doing some listening prayer and feeling the Holy Spirit just say, I have it, I'm okay, just release. There's none of that. There's no community. He's just alone by himself in a pagan land, in a prison, no sense of God's presence, just crickets rotting away in a dungeon for 2 years waiting. Can you imagine what that would have felt like? That's what a lot of life feels like. Now it's better now. We have community. We have the Holy Spirit, for sure. But there are often months or years or at least seasons where we just feel like that. We just feel like we're doing our thing. Maybe you feel like you're stuck. Maybe you feel like you're in prison. It's called school or whatever, or internship or whatever, also known as slavery, whatever, especially if it's at a church. We used to have interns at our church, and then we found out we were actually breaking the law. So we had to stop, and so far they have yet to sue us, which is great. But we feel like that at times, am I right? A few weeks ago, I finished my read through the Bible in a year. I don't know if anybody does that. It's kind of a thing from the 80s where you used to read the Bible. But I read through the Bible. That came out kind of egotistical, but you know it's true. So I read through the Bible every year, and as I get to the end of the year, I come to all what's called the minor prophets, and not because they're not important, because they're shorter. And one of my favorite things to do when I read through the prophets Zechariah, Malachi, and Haggai is just to count up, in between each vision or dream or prophecy or poetry, there is usually a little one-line kind of timestamp. In the second year of King whoever, in the fourth month, the word of the Lord came to me. And then you read the poem or the dream or the whatever. One of my favorite things to do is just to count up the time between. Sometimes it's a few months, sometimes it's a few years, sometimes it's a few decades. For example, Daniel, who is this dreamer all through the Old Testament, we forget that his story takes place over 60 years. So there's 6 visions. Each one's important. Each one's incredible. 1 per decade. Like if you were to write your autobiography as a 80-year-old man, and you're like, I had once a decade, I had this encounter with God, and you just wrote up like a 2,000-word story, it would be amazing. We forget this wasn't like every morning people are waking up and hearing from God, and there's an encounter, there's a dream, and there's a thing. This is like over a lifetime. It's one of my absolute favorite things to do because waiting is hard. At least the way that I'm wired, I'm so bad at it. Waiting is not easy. I'm like wired for long-range planner, strategic, let's go, let's get it done, type A. Living in the future is easy for me. Living in the here and now, that does not come naturally. But again, the longer I follow Jesus, the more I realize the only thing that is ever real is right now. The future is an idea. The past is a memory. The only thing that is ever real is right here, right now. And honestly, to the degree that I slow down and I fully inhabit this present moment, the person in front of me, the coffee in front of me, this experience I'm in the middle of, to the degree that I'm actually all the way there with God and the people around me, my own soul, is to the degree to which I am full of joy and full of peace and full of love and full of all that the Spirit has for me. All that to say, the gap between dream and reality is usually much longer than any of us expect. But if your dream is from God, and not all dreams are, but if your dream is from God, or even part of it is, then there is a time on the horizon when it will come to pass. One of my favorite phrases all through the scriptures, Old and New Testament, is, quote, the appointed time. You can only be pregnant for so long. At some point, that dream that's in you, it has to come out into the world. And when it's finally here, number 4, if you're taking notes, it's better. When Joseph's dream finally comes to pass, it's different, it's harder, it's longer, but it's also better than he was ever expecting. But not necessarily better by Joseph's human metrics. Joseph's dream, or at least his interpretation of his dream, was all about his own glory. And you pick that up really fast. Like his pride is just dripping off the page. And he did get glory eventually. He's the number 2 man, but after years of humiliation. And in the end, notice the dream wasn't about Joseph at all. It was about saving the family of God. What's the first line in the story? This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17. Did you pick that up? This wasn't about Joseph. This was about saving the family of Jacob, also known as Israel, in order to create a nation out of which to birth the Messiah of Israel and the world, to rescue and save all of humanity. So like Joseph thinks, oh, this is about me and my brother is bowing down to me. It's not about you. You are a very small part of a much larger story. And yes, you're an object of God's affection, but you are wrapped up in something so much larger and more beautiful than yourself. But before God could bring Joseph's dream to pass, he had to strip it of all Joseph's ego and his idolatry. And that unless if I'm missing something, that is God's MO. He takes our dreams that most of the time are all about our glory, that are all about us, and then he makes us wait. And maybe a few lousy things happen. Maybe the exact opposite of what we were expecting happens. Maybe we thought, I'm going to be a ruler, and actually you're going to be a slave. Maybe there's a false accusation. Maybe there's a a tangent in prison. Maybe there's who knows what. And the beautiful thing that happens in that waiting period is the dream is stripped of all of its ego and idolatry down to the raw essence, the part of it that is from God, and we are stripped down too. And we grow and mature into the kind of people who can steward the fulfillment of that dream with wisdom, humility, and Christ-like character. Think about Joseph, the before and after. He is an arrogant fool at the beginning. By the end, he is humble and he is wise. I can't do it for you. Only God can interpret the dream. He's saying that over and over again. And he is wise. He's literally Pharaoh, who's a smart dude, is saying this is the wisest man in all of the empire. So arrogant fool became wise man of humility. How? Through waiting, pain, prison, humiliation, failure, embarrassment, doubt. When people have dreams come to pass too early, it is rarely a good thing because they don't have the character yet to steward it. And frankly, most of the time they can't even enjoy it because it's an idol. Think of every childhood celebrity you've ever heard of. There's one from Canada. He hasn't done all that well in his personal life, right? Like, when we get too much wealth, money, success, whatever it is too soon, we're not ready for it. We can't steward it, much less enjoy it. And so first, God has to deal with the idolatry of the dream. Often the dream becomes our God rather than a gift from God. If we're honest, we want the dream more than we want the God who gave it. We want that marriage, we want that business, we want that career, we want that city, we want that opportunity, we want that platform, we want that whatever, far more than we want the God who actually put that dream in our heart. We think that dream will satisfy us and make us content when no dream can do that. Only God can do that, and he can do that right here and right now, not just in the future. And so God will often let our dream die in order to free our heart of its idolatry, to free our character of its ego, its need to control and manipulate and get our own way and make it all about us, to bring us to a place where we are content with God and God himself. And then once we get there, and trust me, that is not an easy place to get to. And most of us go there against our will. But when you get there to contentment, you become the kind of person who is finally ready for the fulfillment of the dream. You can steward it. You're smart. You're humble. You know what to get. You can enjoy it because you wake up every day and you just realize this is a gift. I remember what it was like before this. And I'm not happier in this. I'm the same person I was, but man, this is a gift. And you can give it away. And you know what the thing is? You don't really even need it anymore because you have God. And you know who you are. And you're at peace in your own skin. I've been thinking a lot about Paul's line at the end of the letter to the church in Philippi. The line that people tear out of context all the time is, I can do all this through Christ. People say, I can do anything through Christ who strengthens me. It's not actually what he says. He says, I can do all this through Christ who strengthens me. And people talk about, well, that means I can start this business, I can overcome this addiction, I can do, great, that's all fantastic. But if you actually read that line in context, he's writing about contentment. And he's writing about how hard it is to be content when you're poor, and ironically, when you're wealthy. And he says, I've learned the secret of being content. I've learned to be abased, and I've learned to abound. And then he goes, and I can do all this through Christ who strengthens me. I'll tell you what's way harder than like start a business, become famous. I don't know how to do that. But whatever your thing is, what's way harder than any of that is to become content. Right here, right now. And Paul says, there's a secret, and I know it. I can do it. How? Through Christ who strengthens me, through living ongoing relationship right here, right now with the Spirit of Jesus himself. I can be content in college. I can be content working part-time at this place. I can be content in this neighborhood. I can be content with this body. I can be content with this IQ. I can be content with this. Whatever your limitation is, we all have them. Right here, right now, I can be content. And so this is why I think dreams often go through this cycle, this Jesus-like cycle of death and burial and resurrection. There's a death to a dream. And Abraham and Isaac kind of like, this has to die. There's a burial, a season often when you're just waiting in prison and you feel like it's dead. And then sometimes, not always, but a lot of the time, there is a resurrection. But when it comes back to life, it's not the same. It's better. but not better by the human metrics of money, success, wealth, whatever it is. We're so upside down. Better by the metrics of what really matters in the end. And we find that dream was more than worth the wait. So, different, harder, longer, better. I know that sounds like a Nike advertisement, but I would actually argue that is a biblical theology of dreams. I would argue you can lay this template over pretty much any character and any dream in the Bible. Moses, his dream to lead Israel out of slavery. Paul, his dream to preach the gospel to the nations. David, his dream for the temple in Jerusalem. As I said before, God's people have always been dreamers. Now, to end, basically tonight, as we begin a new year, I know some people are, like the cynical people are all down on New Year's and resolutions. I love it. I think it's great. And this is a time where we think about the future, where we dream about the future. And I guess this is just a call to dream, but not in a self-helpy kind of way, in a reality kind of way. A call to dream, and please dream bigger than the tired, old, uncreative dream of North America. Dream bigger than a salary number. And I don't mean a bigger salary number. Dream bigger than that house with that many square feet. Dream bigger than a vacation to Kauai every year. Dream bigger than, just dream past that to the King and the kingdom of God. Let Jesus wants you to be successful. The thing is, he just wants to radically redefine what success is in your mind's eye. And he would just take serious issue with our culture's definition of success. And he would say, that looks actually a lot more like failure. Dream radically bigger, deeper, longer, wider than our culture, but let the Holy Spirit drip into your mind, your imagination, your heart, into your life, a dream, an identity. This is who you are, a calling, and accept it. If it's not what you're expecting or not even what you want, just say yes to it. Follow Jesus into it. As we end, as I was just praying during worship, and what a great time of singing, I just really had this sense, not over one or two, but actually over the room, over a lot of you, that there's just been like this lid on dreaming, almost like a sense of oppression over this community. Like there's been like a ceiling on a low ceiling over your dreams. Maybe due to a family of origin, a family saying this is the path, or maybe due to a cultural moment, or to our economy, or to your culture. I don't even know. And that's not my job to speculate. But I get the sense that for some of you, you really have never had the freedom and the faith to actually dream in collaboration and cooperation with the Holy Spirit, and to let God fill your mind and imagination with something that could be. Knowing it will be different, it will be longer, it will be harder, it will be better, but it will be worth it.